So I'll hand over to Anne-Marie and look forward to hearing the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming along today. I'm really pleased to be doing this seminar. I think it's an important issue, and I think the findings come at a really opportune time for Northern Ireland. As Gillian said, this research is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and that funding allowed us in 2016 to include a full module of questions on attitudes to abortion in the Life and Times survey. And that means that we have a very comprehensive set of data now on public attitudes to abortion. Now, it's not possible today to go into all of the data in a lot of detail, so I'm actually going to present just some of the key findings. But as Gillian said, all of the information, the tables and so on, are available on the website, and there will be further research outputs based on this data. So what I'm mainly going to focus on today, as you can see from the slide, is views on the legality and illegality of abortion, the extent to which people's views vary across a range of scenarios, the relationship between religious affiliation and non-affiliation and attitudes to abortion, whether views have changed over time, because in the past we have asked a small number of questions in a few of the Life and Times surveys and actually in some of the old social attitude surveys as well. And then people's views on the criminalisation of abortion. Now, as you can immediately see, these are all very, very timely issues. But before getting into the data, just might be useful just to spend a minute or two just setting out the legislative context for Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it was the 1967 Abortion Act which established legal abortion in Britain, and of course that was never extended to Northern Ireland, but that allows abortion up to 24 weeks gestation now if two doctors certify that continuing the pregnancy would involve greater risk than termination to the physical or mental health of the pregnant woman or any of her existing children. And then abortions after 24 weeks are allowed if continuing the pregnancy would cause greater risk than termination to the life of the woman or permanent injury to her physical or mental health, or where there is a substantial risk that the child, if born, will have serious disabilities. Now, in Northern Ireland, access to abortion is much more restricted and is only permitted if a woman's life is at risk or if there is risk to her mental or physical health and that risk is long-term or permanent. Now, I think contrary to what a lot of the public believed for many years, fetal abnormalities, even if fatal, rape and incest are not circumstances in Northern Ireland in which abortions can be performed legally. Now, the law in abortion in Northern Ireland is governed by the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, which says that anyone who uses any poison or other noxious thing to bring on a miscarriage is guilty of an offence with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. And that was really our motivation for including the questions on attitudes to criminalisation. We know that few people can access legal abortion in Northern Ireland, and in fact, in 2015-2016, only 16 legal abortions were carried out. But many women travel to Great Britain every year to obtain an abortion. The number of women travelling has declined, but it's still more than 700 just in the most previous year. And what we do know is that many more women are now accessing abortion pills online. Now, the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive is responsible for abortion policy in Northern Ireland. It's a devolved responsibility, and that's been the case since 2010, when responsibility for abortion was devolved as part of the widening policing and justice powers. Now, one of the difficult issues for Northern Ireland has been a lack of clarity around when an abortion is legally permitted or not. And that's been unclear to women who seek abortions, but also unclear to the health professionals who have to make that decision. As many of you will be aware, lengthy legal challenges by the Family Planning Association for Northern Ireland to address the lack of clarity in the law eventually resulted in the publication of guidance by the Department of Health in 2016. So the only thing really I want to say on that is the guidance is mainly for medical professionals and is not a replacement for legislation. So it's not abortion policy or abortion law. So then, what do the Northern Ireland public think about abortion law in Northern Ireland? So we presented NILT respondents with a number of scenarios, and we asked if they thought that abortion should be legal or illegal in particular circumstances, which you're going to see in a moment. Now, I will just say that you will see that in some areas there is very strong support, in other areas less so. So where we have the strongest support is where a serious health condition means there is risk to the life of the woman from continuing the pregnancy, where there is serious threat to the woman's physical or mental health, where there is a fatal or serious fetal abnormality, and where the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. So just to go through those findings in a little bit more detail. Very much a majority of respondents, in fact 83%, believe that abortion should definitely or probably be legal in cases where a serious health condition means that a woman will die if she has to continue with the pregnancy. And a majority of that 83%, 56%, say that abortion should definitely be legal. Where there's a serious threat to the woman's physical or mental health in continuing the pregnancy, 76% of those taking part in the survey believed that abortion should definitely or probably be legal. Again, a very significant majority, 81%, think that abortion should definitely or probably be legal where the fetus has a serious abnormality and will not survive the birth. So when people were asked about where the fetus has a serious abnormality and may not survive the birth, the number supporting legal abortion in those circumstances was 73%, so still high. And then 78% say that abortion should be legal in cases of rape or incest. And more than half of those, 54%, think that it should definitely be legal. Now, as you can also see, there is much less support for abortion being legal where a woman wants an abortion because she has become pregnant and does not want to have any more children. And here, 43% hold the view that in such a circumstance, abortion should definitely not be legal. And a further 17% think that it probably should not be legal. So again, that's a majority of people thinking that way. Okay, so what's also noteworthy from that slide and from this data is the response to this statement, which is where a doctor says there is more risk to the life of a pregnant woman, if she can, maybe just helpful to go back to that, if she continues with the pregnancy than if she were to have an abortion. Now, as you can see, only 19% of people think that abortion should definitely or probably be illegal in this circumstance. Now, that statement is based on the wording of Ground C of the 1967 Abortion Act, which states that abortion is legal if two doctors believe that the continuance of the pregnancy would involve risk to the life of the pregnant woman greater than if the pregnancy were terminated. So in that case, only 19% of NILT respondents think that abortion should definitely or probably be illegal. And that, in fact, is the ground under which 98% of abortions are carried out in England and Wales. So I think that is actually quite an important finding. Okay, so one of our interesting findings was when we started to break down the data. Analysis of the data shows that with regard to those various scenarios, there are some differences in some cases between the views of men and women, with men being maybe slightly more likely than women to say that abortion should be legal. And in some cases, there are differences depending on the age group. So, for example, those in the 25 to 34 age group are the age group most likely to think that abortion should be legal in these circumstances. Now, that actually doesn't hold constant through the survey, because in some of the other questions, as you'll see later on, it's slightly older age groups who appear to have more liberal views on some things. But it's really when we look at religion that the differences become much more apparent. So, across all situations, got it there, respondents of no religion were more likely than Catholics or Protestants to say that abortion should be legal, and Catholics were the least likely to say that abortion should be legal. Now, the strongest consensus between Catholics and Protestants was in relation to the scenario where a woman wants to have an abortion because she has become pregnant and does not want to have children. And here, responses were quite similar in terms of people being opposed to abortion being legal in that circumstance. And as we'll also see later, that finding, which associates religious affiliation with attitudes to abortion, is something that the British Social Attitude Survey also found when they asked similar questions in 2012. We then presented, sorry, that was just, yeah, you can see it's just, I'll let you have a moment or two to look at those tables. So you can see that in cases of rape or incest, the difference is there. Now, we presented respondents with a different set of circumstances and asked if a pregnant woman in Northern Ireland should be allowed to have an abortion in each of these. Now, as you can see from the figure, there is much less support for abortion in these cases than in the previous scenarios that you've had the opportunity to look at. So, little support for allowing a pregnant woman to have an abortion if she's about to start a new job, if she has lost her job, if she feels she has already completed her family, if the family's on a low income and the family feels that it can't afford any more children, if the woman has a partner who is dying of cancer, or if the partner is abusive. Now, respondents are more supportive of allowing abortion in other scenarios, but from this figure, you can see that the data shows us that the only situation where a majority would allow an abortion is when a 15-year-old girl is pregnant. And here, 53% of people said that in that circumstance, abortion should be allowed. Now, we do have limited data for comparing attitudes over time. And I think that's one of the things that's so important about this survey, is it gives us this richness of baseline data now. But a small number of questions about abortion were included in previous Life and Time surveys and in the predecessor survey, the Northern Ireland Social Attitude Survey in 1990. I would just say that the wording is not identical to the wording used in the 2016 questions, but I think they do allow us to have some insight, and they do seem to suggest that there is evidence that support for abortion in some circumstances has increased among the Northern Ireland public, including among people with a religious affiliation. So, in 1990, the Northern Ireland Social Attitude Survey asked whether the law should allow abortion where there is a strong chance of a defect in the baby, where the pregnancy was a result of rape, and where the woman's health was seriously endangered by the pregnancy. And in 1990, there was support for the law allowing abortion in all three cases. And the greatest support at that time was where the woman's health was seriously endangered and where pregnancy was a result of rape. Now, there were a small number of questions in the 1998, 2004 and 2008 Northern Ireland Life and Time surveys. And in those years, about a half of the population said it was not at all or only sometimes wrong to have an abortion if there was a strong chance of serious defect in the baby. So about 50% of people thought that at the time. And as you've seen earlier, in 2016, 81% of those surveyed think that the law should definitely or probably allow abortion. So I think that does indicate that there has probably been a shift in attitudes over time. In 1990, 71% of NISA respondents were in favour of the law allowing abortion where a woman had become pregnant as a result of a rape. In 2016, the figure is 78%, just to remind you. As we've just been saying, there was less support in 2016 for abortion in some other circumstances, and that was also the case in previous surveys. So 65% of people currently think that abortion should probably or definitely not be allowed, for example, if a family was on low income and couldn't afford any more children, and that would have been very, very similar to the findings in previous years. One constant through all of the questions where they've been asked in surveys and with the British Social Attitude Survey has been the association between religious faith and attitudes to abortion. So responses to previous social attitude surveys and life and time survey questions show that Catholics have tended to be less accepting of abortion than Protestants, with the strongest support being expressed by those of no religion. But, and this has also been the case in Britain, people with a religious affiliation we can see have become more accepting of abortion in some circumstances in line with general population. So in Northern Ireland, this has been though particularly noticeable amongst Catholics. So in 1990, only 28% of Catholics compared to 75% of Protestants, and 78% of those with no religion thought that the law should allow abortion where there's a strong chance of a serious defect in the baby. In 2016, 72% of Catholics agreed that abortion should definitely or probably be legal where the fetus has a fatal abnormality and the baby will not survive the birth. 62% of Catholics thought this should be the case where there was a serious abnormality which meant the baby may not survive the birth. Over half of Catholics, just over half, 52% in 1990, said that the law should allow abortion where the woman's health is seriously endangered. In 2016, 65% of Catholics thought that that should be the case. So I think certainly we can see that even amongst those of religious faith, that attitudes have become more supportive of abortion in some circumstances. Now, over the years, we have all heard the argument that, or the question perhaps, that whether or not Northern Ireland exports a problem of abortion rather than dealing with it. And we asked the Life and Times respondents about their views on this. As I said earlier, for many years, women have travelled from Northern Ireland to access abortions in Britain and to pay for these privately because they haven't been available to women on the NHS service in Britain. In recent years, the number doing so has declined, we think probably due to the increasing use of abortion medication purchased online. But even so, in 2016, more than 700 women travelled to England to obtain an abortion. As we've been hearing this week, women living in England, Scotland and Wales have access to NHS-funded abortions, and women from Northern Ireland have not been permitted that access in Britain. Of course, the legal case in 2014 sought to establish the right of women from Northern Ireland to access abortions funded by the NHS, and that legal case was unsuccessful. That then went to the Supreme Court, and then on Wednesday of this week, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal by a majority of 3-2, and this is something I want to come back to, just the implications of that at the end of the presentation. But what do people in Northern Ireland think about some of those issues? Very strong support for the view that we are exporting our problems rather than dealing with them. 77% of those surveyed agreed with this statement. And here it's 45 to 54-year-olds who are the age group who are most likely to strongly agree. Catholics were less likely than Protestants or those with no religion to agree, but the proportion saying that this was the case was still very high at 73%, and that's compared to 80% of Protestants and 82% of those with no religion. The fact that, as you can see, that women in Britain can have an abortion within the NHS, but Northern Ireland women cannot, was also viewed by most people as unfair. So 77% of people perceived this to be unfair. And again, this was the view of the majority of Catholics. 71% of Catholics thought this was the case, 80% of Protestants, and 84% of people of no religion. We were also very interested, as you might expect, to look at the issue of criminalisation and people's attitudes to criminalisation, and we have had some very high-profile cases in terms of prosecutions as well. So the figures do show us that about 700 women ordered pills online from just one of the feminist websites in 2016. So I think this is increasingly perhaps how people have been and will continue to access abortions. So respondents were given 4 different circumstances, 4 different scenarios, and they were asked for their views on whether a woman in each of those situations should face criminal charges for buying abortion pills online. And overall, as you can clearly see, there is very strong resistance to the criminalisation of pregnant women who buy pills off the internet. In 3 out of 4 of those scenarios, 3/4 of respondents, more than 3/4, feel that a pregnant woman should not face criminal charges for buying pills. And here responses are similar for Catholics, Protestants, and those of no religion in the first 3 scenarios. Now, attitudes were more divided in the situation where a woman buys abortion pills off the internet if she does not want to have children. So 33% thought that in this case, a woman should face criminal charges, but still just over half, 51%, thought the opposite. And those in the 25 to 34 year age group were most likely to say that she should face criminal charges. So 47% of people in this age group thought that that was the case. So even some people, as we know from earlier figures, who would have been opposed to abortions in some circumstances, do not appear to think that women buying pills off the internet should face criminal prosecution. Now, recent prosecutions in Northern Ireland have generated considerable debate. So in 2016, a Belfast woman was given a 3-month jail sentence, suspended for 12 months, after admitting buying abortion pills online and then self-administering them in the first trimester of her pregnancy. In another case, a woman and her partner had charges withdrawn after they accepted cautions. And a case involving a 15-year-old girl has led to a legal challenge to the decision to prosecute her mother for unlawfully obtaining poison with intent to procure a miscarriage after she was reported to the police by a medical professional. Now, the decision to prosecute in each of these cases has been controversial, and it has generated considerable debate about the criminalisation of abortion. And of course, people are open to prosecution with the law as it stands. Section 5 of the Criminal Law Act 1967 places a legal duty unique to Northern Ireland on everyone to report to the police information they may have about a relevant offence being committed. And the most recent DHSSPS guidance, published in 2016, states that health and social care professionals must balance the need for confidentiality of patients with the obligation to report unlawful terminations of pregnancy to the police and the need to protect others from risk of serious harm. But I think in light of what we're seeing in terms of public attitudes, there needs to be an ongoing discussion about this. In line with opposition to the criminalisation of women for buying pills off the internet, 70% of respondents said that a woman should never go to prison for for having an abortion. So that's really in line with those findings. And here again, very similar views amongst Catholics, Protestants, and those of no religion. I just wanted to say also that the majority of respondents, 63%, also disagreed that doctors should face criminal charges if they carry out an abortion. And in terms of whether doctors ought to face criminal charges if they refuse an abortion where a mother's life is at risk and then she dies, 40% said that a doctor should face criminal charges in this situation, and 38% disagreed that they should. And I think perhaps just reflecting all of that, we do have another finding, which is that 70% of those taking part in the Life and Time survey believe that abortion should be a matter for medical regulation and not for criminal law. So coming close to the end of the presentation, it's just maybe helpful to summarise some of the key points. So what we've seen from this very comprehensive survey of public attitudes is strong support among the Northern Ireland public for abortion to be allowed where there's a risk to the life of the woman or a serious risk to her physical or mental health in cases of fatal or serious fetal abnormality and where a pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. The majority of people are opposed to abortion in cases such as where a woman wants an abortion because she doesn't want more children, or because she has lost her job, or because she has a new job. 77% of people think that we are exporting this issue rather than dealing with it in Northern Ireland. And a high proportion of people perceive it as unfair that some women can travel to England for an abortion and others cannot afford to do that, and that women from Northern Ireland cannot access NHS abortion services anywhere else in the UK. We've just seen the strong opposition to the criminalisation of women who buy abortion pills online and to the imprisonment of women for having abortions, and indeed the opposition to doctors facing criminal charges for carrying out abortions. It is very clear that religious faith is associated with attitudes to abortion, with Catholics being less accepting than Protestants and those of no religion, but that there is evidence that support for abortion has increased, including amongst those with a religious affiliation since 1990. So why did we do this? Why do public attitudes on abortion matter? This is a highly complex issue. It's a controversial issue as well, we know that. But that probably makes it all the more important that we have robust evidence on public attitudes. And the research evidence shows us that the Northern Ireland public have nuanced views. But I just wanted to point out that an interesting finding in itself is with a very, very small number of don't knows. Now, quite often in surveys, you can get a substantial proportion of people saying, I don't know, and we didn't find that. And I think that shows us that people have a view on this issue and that they are willing to express it. I think, if we look back over decades, for a long time, there was a nervousness about public debate on abortion. There was a nervousness about media debate. I think that's been overcome. And I think this survey indicates that that's the case. But Northern Ireland does have some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the world. And women who are viewed as infringing these laws and those who assist them are subject to harsh criminal penalties, and that's the fact, the reality of it. I think these findings suggest that abortion legislation as it stands in Northern Ireland is out of step with public opinion, and perhaps that political attitudes on this issue are also out of step with public opinion. But these findings come at a critical juncture, in fact, in Northern Ireland. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court ruled that by a majority of 3-2 to reject the right of Northern Ireland women to access abortion service in Britain funded by the NHS. But Lord Wilson, in his statement, did note that the law had placed women in Northern Ireland facing unwanted pregnancies in a deeply unenviable position. And I think for me, as a social policy person, an interesting aspect of the ruling was the statement that devolutionary powers should be taken into consideration, given the different health authorities in each jurisdiction. But actually, whilst health and criminal justice are devolved responsibilities, human rights is not a devolved responsibility. And it's the Westminster government that has the duty to implement the international human rights conventions and treaties, and for ensuring compliance with those treaties across the United Kingdom jurisdictions. And the Westminster government has been challenged for its failure in this respect on a number of occasions by UN committees, including by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. There is also provision in the 1998 Northern Ireland Act for the Westminster government to legislate on any issue, and there is precedent in that, and I suppose that can be done in a couple of ways, that the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive can pass over responsibility for decision making to the Westminster government, and we saw that happen with welfare reform. But actually the Westminster government can impose policy in Northern Ireland on any issue, although of course with any of the devolved governments it's not been willing, rightly so, I think, to do that. So thank you very much for listening to what I know has been maybe a longer than usual presentation.